Union Pacific built some of the most powerful locomotives in railroad history. They also built some of the most dangerous. From experimental disasters that killed their crews to massive engines scrapped after catastrophic failures, these are the locomotives that Union Pacific would rather you forget ever existed. The Union Pacific 119 holds one of the most ironic fates in railroad history. This 440 American-type locomotive stood at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869, representing Union Pacific at the ceremony that joined the Transcontinental Railroad. It was photographed alongside Central Pacific's Jupiter in one of the most famous images in American history. The Golden Spike ceremony made the 119 a symbol of national achievement and the triumph of engineering. But here is where it gets painful. After the ceremony, the 119 returned to regular freight service as if nothing had happened. No museum preservation, no historical protection, just another locomotive hauling cargo across the plains. By 1903, the engine that had witnessed history was worn out and obsolete. Union Pacific sold it for scrap. The price was $1,000. One of the most historically significant locomotives in American history was melted down for the value of its metal. A replica was not built until 1979, when the National Park Service finally decided someone should remember what the original looked like. The 119's fate represents everything wrong with how railroads treated heritage equipment in the early 20th century. The 440 American-type locomotives that built the Transcontinental Railroad were death traps by modern standards. Between 1863 and 1869, Union Pacific construction crews pushed west through hostile territory with locomotives that had virtually no safety features. Boilers operated at pressures that terrified engineers. There were no automatic brakes, no signals, and no track standards worth mentioning. Crews worked in open cabs, exposed to weather, cinders, and the constant threat of boiler explosions. These locomotives burned wood, requiring stops every 40 miles to refuel. The locomotives themselves were barely adequate for the terrain. Grades that seemed manageable on paper became nightmares in practice. Engines would stall, slide backward, and sometimes derail on curves too sharp for their wheelbases. Contemporary accounts describe regular accidents, scaldings from burst pipes, and deaths from collisions on single-track lines with no dispatching system. These early engines established Union Pacific's appetite for power over safety. The railroad learned you could push equipment and crews to their limits and still complete the job. That philosophy would echo through every dangerous locomotive that followed. Union Pacific's first-generation gas turbine electric locomotives seemed like the future of railroading when they arrived in 1952. Numbered 51 through 60, these units promised to replace aging steam power with something revolutionary. General Electric delivered machines generating 4,500 horsepower, essentially a jet engine on rails. The turbines burned Bunker C heavy fuel oil, a cheap industrial residue that most people considered waste. Union Pacific thought they had found a bargain. The turbines consumed fuel at twice the rate of equivalent diesel locomotives. Turbine blades suffered constant erosion from the dirty fuel. Soot buildup clogged critical systems. Exhaust temperatures reached 850 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt asphalt when locomotives idled near crossings. Workers could not approach without risking severe burns. The noise was catastrophic. These were not just loud locomotives, they were jet engines in rail yards, screaming turbines audible for miles. Cities along Union Pacific's main line banned them from urban areas. By 1964, all 10 first-generation units were retired and scrapped, having proven that revolutionary technology sometimes simply does not work. The second-generation gas turbine electric locomotives earned the nickname verandas for the distinctive walkways along their flanks. Units 61 through 75 arrived, starting in 1954, carrying 4,500 horsepower with supposedly improved reliability. The improvements were marginal. These locomotives developed a terrifying habit of flaming out in tunnels. The turbines required massive amounts of air, and when oxygen levels dropped in confined spaces, the engines would simply quit. Imagine hauling heavy freight through a mountain tunnel when your locomotive suddenly loses all power. The train would coast to a stop in choking fumes, leaving crews trapped until help arrived. Union Pacific modified the locomotives to run with diesel helpers, defeating the entire purpose of having a single powerful prime mover. The verandas retained all first-generation problems: excessive fuel consumption, blade erosion, extreme noise, and heat that could injure anyone nearby. Maintenance crews dreaded working on them. The fuel system required heating bunker C oil to 200 degrees before it could flow through injectors. One leaked connection meant catastrophic burns. All 15 verandas were retired and scrapped by the late 1960s. The DD-35A locomotives represented Union Pacific's attempt to get diesel power equivalent to gas turbines without the turbine problems. These massive units placed two complete diesel prime movers on a single frame, generating 5,000 horsepower. Electromotive Division built them starting in 1965. Union Pacific loved the raw power. Track crews did not. The DD-35A rode on two 4-axle trucks, concentrating enormous weight on 8 wheels instead of spreading it across 12. This axle loading destroyed rail at an alarming rate. Curves that had handled normal locomotives for decades suddenly developed gauge spreading and rail failures. Bridge engineers nervously recalculated load limits whenever DD-35As were assigned to routes. The concentrated weight also caused derailments. When rails spread under the pounding, the massive locomotives would simply leave the track, taking everything behind them into the ditch. Union Pacific eventually restricted where DD-35As could operate, eliminating much of their usefulness. Why own the most powerful locomotive if you can't run it on half your railroad? With two prime movers sharing electrical systems, a failure in one often cascaded into the other. All DD-35As were retired by 1981. Centennial locomotive number 6903 died violently somewhere on Union Pacific's network. The exact details have faded from official records, but the outcome is clear. This 6,600 horsepower giant was wrecked beyond repair and scrapped. The DDA-40X Centennials were supposed to answer the multi-unit diesel problem. They were built by Electromotive Division from 1969 to 1971, and they placed two complete locomotives on one frame. 47 units rolled out of LaGrange, Illinois, each 98 feet long and weighing 270 tons, the largest diesel-electric locomotives ever built. But size does not protect against physics. When number 6903 met its end, whether through collision, derailment, or other catastrophe, the damage was too extensive to justify rebuilding. Union Pacific stripped anything salvageable and sent the carcass to cutting torches. The Centennials were already proving expensive to maintain, their twin-engine configuration creating twice the maintenance headaches. Frame cracking developed at full fuel loads. The 8,000-gallon tanks apparently stressed structures beyond design limits. The loss of number 6903 was an expensive reminder that even the mightiest locomotives remain vulnerable to the violent forces railroading can unleash. Centennial locomotive number 6921 met the same fate as number 6903. It was destroyed in a wreck so severe that Union Pacific chose scrapping rather than repair. Together, these two units represent nearly 5% of the entire Centennial fleet lost to accidents. The destruction of number 6921 reduced 270 tons of the most powerful diesel locomotive ever built to twisted metal and spare parts. Details of the wreck remain scarce, but the financial calculations were straightforward. Rebuilding a wrecked Centennial required specialized knowledge, rare parts, and enormous expense. By the time number 6921 met its end, Union Pacific was questioning whether the Centennial experiment had been worthwhile. Their twin-engine configuration made them maintenance heavy. Other railroads refused them in run-through service, forcing power swaps at interchange points. When recession hit in 1980, Union Pacific stored the entire surviving fleet in the California desert. Some returned briefly from 1984 to 1985, but the last regular Centennial run occurred in May 1985. Today, 13 survive in museums. Number 6, 921, exists only in photographs and maintenance records, another monument to the dangers of pushing locomotive technology too far. On November 2, 1979, a Union Pacific GP20 became the centerpiece of a horrifying grade crossing accident. The locomotive was pulling a 12-car local freight through Spokane, Washington, when it struck a gasoline tanker truck. The impact separated the tank trailer from the truck and flipped it onto the tracks, where the train pushed it 150 feet before stopping. Then the fuel ignited. The resulting fireball rose over 100 feet into the air and engulfed the locomotive. All 4 crew members attempted to flee on foot, running from the cab as flames consumed everything behind them. 3 died from their injuries. The locomotive, believed to be Union Pacific number 493, was retired the following month and moved to Pocatello to await resolution of legal questions about the accident. It never ran again. The investigation revealed the brutal reality of grade crossing accidents. Even a relatively small locomotive can create catastrophic consequences when it meets the wrong vehicle at the wrong moment. The GP20 was not a dangerous design. It had the misfortune to be in the wrong place when a gasoline truck failed to yield. That randomness makes railroading permanently unpredictable and occasionally deadly. The Longview Junction collision on November 11, 1993, destroyed 8 locomotives in a single catastrophic impact. Union Pacific Units 2475 and 3388 led a northbound piggyback train on Burlington Northern tracks about 30 miles north of Portland, Oregon. Heading toward them was a southbound Burlington Northern freight with 111 cars. At 12:25 in the morning, the 2 trains met head-on at combined speeds approaching 100 miles per hour. All 5 crew members died instantly. The force compressed 8 locomotives into the space normally occupied by 2. The lead units ceased to exist as recognizable machines, their frames driven into each other with enough force to weld steel without heat. Union Pacific operated over Burlington Northern tracks through trackage rights agreements, running trains through territory controlled by another railroad's dispatchers. Something went catastrophically wrong that night. The investigation determined fault, but no finding could bring back the 5 men who died or restore the locomotives that were destroyed. The wreckage was cleared, track repaired, and trains resumed within days. Longview Junction became another entry in the long list of head-on disasters that plague railroading. Union Pacific's Challenger-class locomotives were supposed to be the ultimate freight haulers. Built between 1936 and 1943, these 4 664 articulated giants could pull tonnage that would have required multiple locomotives in earlier eras. American Locomotive Company delivered 105 Challengers, each weighing over 1 million pounds fully loaded. But 103 of those 105 went to the scrapyard. The Challengers had problems from the beginning. Early models struggled on the 1.14% Wasatch grade that was their primary territory. Instead of hauling trains single-handedly, they required helpers and double heading over the mountains. The articulated frame that allowed them to navigate curves introduced maintenance complications. Steam joints between the front and rear engine units needed constant attention to prevent leaks that robbed power. By the early 1960s, diesel locomotives had proven more economical. Union Pacific retired the entire fleet between 1956 and 1962. Most went straight to scrap dealers who cut them apart for steel value. Today, only 2 survive. Locomotive 3977 is on static display in North Platte. Locomotive 3985 was donated to a museum for potential restoration. The Challengers represented everything Union Pacific wanted and everything that ultimately failed them. The third-generation turbine electric locomotives were Union Pacific's final attempt to make turbine power work. Known as the Big Blows for their deafening exhaust, these 8,500 horsepower monsters were the most powerful single-unit locomotives ever built. General Electric delivered 30 units from 1958 to 1961, each consisting of a cab unit and a massive turbine unit connected by cables. The noise was legendary. When a big blow opened its throttle, the sound could be heard for miles. The turbine exhaust shot from roof vents at 150 miles per hour, reaching temperatures of 850 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat was intense enough to melt pavement beneath idling locomotives. Workers learned to give them wide berth. The exhaust could cause severe burns from surprising distances. Fuel consumption remained atrocious, roughly twice what equivalent diesel power would burn. But as long as bunker C fuel stayed cheap, Union Pacific tolerated the inefficiency. When oil prices rose in the late 1960s, the economics collapsed. All 30 big blows were retired by 1970. Their brief careers ended by the same fuel costs that had made them attractive in the first place. Today, only 2 survive in museums, silent monuments to the loudest locomotives ever built. Union Pacific's coal turbine experiment was desperation disguised as innovation. In October 1962, the railroad cobbled together the strangest locomotive ever assembled. They took a modified Alco PA-1 cab unit, mated it to the chassis of a scrapped Great Northern Electric locomotive, added a turbine from one of their retired gas turbines, and connected everything to a tender rebuilt from Challenger 3990. The result was numbered 80, later renumbered 8080. It stretched 226 feet from end to end, making it the longest locomotive ever built. The idea was to burn pulverized coal instead of expensive oil. Coal was cheap, and Union Pacific hauled mountains of it. If they could make a coal turbine work, they would have unlimited cheap fuel. They could not make it work. Coal dust destroyed everything it touched. Grinding the coal fine enough to burn properly was nearly impossible. Particles that were too large damaged the turbine blades instantly. Particles that were too fine clogged the forward traction motors and shorted electrical systems. The conventional gas turbines logged over 1 million miles each. The coal turbine managed fewer than 10,000 miles before Union Pacific gave up in 1968. The experiment was scrapped, another dead end in the search for alternatives to diesel. 17 of Union Pacific's 25 big boy locomotives went to the cutting torches. These were the largest steam locomotives ever built, 132 feet long and weighing over 1 million pounds with their tender. The American Locomotive Company delivered them between 1941 and 1944, specifically for the brutal climb over the Wasatch Mountains between Ogden and Green River. They were magnificent machines, capable of hauling massive trains over grades that would stall lesser power. But magnificence does not guarantee survival. When diesel locomotives proved more economical in the late 1950s, Union Pacific began retiring the big boys. The last one ran in revenue service in July 1959. Within 3 years, 17 had been scrapped. Think about that. The railroad destroyed 2/3 of the largest steam locomotives ever built, machines that represented the absolute pinnacle of steam technology. They were cut apart for the value of their steel, their massive boilers sectioned and melted down. 8 survived only because museums and cities requested them for display. Today, just one, the 4014, operates again after a $4 million restoration. The other survivors sit silent, preserved but motionless reminders of the 17 siblings that became scrap metal. Union Pacific 844 nearly died in 1999. The 844 is a 484 Northern, and it was the last steam locomotive delivered to Union Pacific, arriving in 1944 and never officially retired. It is the only steam locomotive in America to remain in continuous service with its original owner. Then the boiler tubes collapsed. During a June 1999 excursion, the tubes from a 1996 overhaul failed catastrophically. They had been manufactured from the wrong material, and 3 years of service proved too much. The tubes collapsed inside the boiler, ending the locomotive's operation instantly. For 5 years, The 844 sat silent in the Cheyenne shops while Union Pacific debated whether to repair it or finally retire the aging machine. Steam expertise was increasingly rare. Parts had to be custom manufactured. The cost would be substantial. Union Pacific chose restoration. A dedicated steam crew rebuilt the boiler with proper materials, replacing the failed tubes and returning the locomotive to operation in November 2004. The 844 runs today because Union Pacific decided heritage mattered more than convenience. But those 5 silent years represented a real possibility that America's most famous operating steam locomotive might never run again. The 412-2 Union Pacific type locomotives were built specifically for Union Pacific and named after the railroad. Between 1926 and 1930, the American Locomotive Company delivered 88 of these 3-cylinder giants, each carrying 12 massive driving wheels. They were the only 4 12-2 locomotives ever built for any American railroad, a wheel arrangement so specialized that Union Pacific literally owned the design. The 3-cylinder configuration was supposed to provide smoother power delivery than conventional 2-cylinder designs. In practice, it created maintenance nightmares. The inside cylinder was nearly inaccessible, buried deep within the locomotive frame. Repairs that took hours on conventional engines required days on a 412-2. The valve gear for that hidden 3rd cylinder wore at alarming rates, and every repair meant partially disassembling the locomotive. By the late 1940s, the 412-2s were obsolete and troublesome. Union Pacific began scrapping them in 1948. The program was complete by 1956, with 87 of the 88 locomotives reduced to scrap. Only the prototype, number 9000, survived, preserved in Pomona, California. The rest simply vanished, their innovative but impractical design consigned to memory and maintenance manuals. On October 20, 1948, Union Pacific 4, 12-2 locomotive 9018 exploded at Upland, Kansas. The boiler let go with catastrophic force, killing the engineer, the fireman, and the brakeman instantly. The crown sheet had failed, the metal barrier separating the firebox from the water in the boiler. When a crown sheet fails, the superheated water above it flashes instantly to steam, expanding 1,600 times by volume. The explosion is essentially a bomb detonating inside the locomotive. The 9018 was destroyed so completely that investigators struggled to reconstruct what had happened. Evidence pointed to low water in the boiler, though the exact sequence of events died with the crew. The locomotive had been running normally until suddenly it was not. 3 men were alive one moment and dead the next, victims of the most feared failure in steam railroading. Boiler explosions were relatively rare by 1948, as safety technology had improved dramatically since the 19th century. But when they happened, they were invariably fatal. The destruction of 9018 reminded everyone that steam locomotives, for all their power and romance, carried death inside their boilers every moment they operated. The Big Boy. 4005 became the only locomotive of its class involved in a major fatal accident. On April 27, 1953, the massive engine was hauling 62 cars across southern Wyoming when disaster struck at the Red Desert siding. A section man had opened a siding switch for track maintenance, then saw the 600-ton locomotive barreling toward him at 50 miles per hour. He tried desperately to close the switch, but could not get it shut in time. The Big Boy entered the open switch at full speed and derailed instantly. The locomotive careened off the rails and slid along its left side, tearing up track and roadbed for hundreds of feet. The tender slammed into the cab, crushing it completely. Engineer Leo Murray and fireman Lawrence Endress died on impact. Brakeman James Anderton survived the initial wreck, but died days later from severe burns. Union Pacific repaired the 4005 and returned it to service, where it ran until retirement in 1962. Today, it sits in the Forney Museum in Denver, the only Big Boy with blood on its history. The repaired frame and rebuilt cab hide the violence of that April morning when 3 men died. The General Electric steam turbine locomotives of 1938 represented Union Pacific's first attempt to revolutionize motive power. General Electric spent 3 years and $2 million building 2 streamlined units that promised to replace conventional steam. The locomotives were delivered in April 1939, each capable of producing 2,500 horsepower and supposedly reaching 125 miles per hour. Union Pacific put them on display tours, showed them to President Roosevelt, and proclaimed the future of railroading had arrived. The future lasted 6 months. The steam turbines were mechanical disasters. Turbine blades fell out of alignment whenever the locomotives coupled to trains. Fly ash contaminated the electrical machinery. The feed water heaters failed repeatedly. On one memorable occasion, both units failed while hauling a train from Colorado to Omaha. A conventional steam locomotive had to tow the future of railroading to its destination. By June 1939, Union Pacific returned both units to General Electric. The railroad eventually abandoned the project in December 1941. Both locomotives were scrapped before World War II ended, their $2 million promise reduced to scrap value. Union Pacific's relationship with experimental locomotives followed a consistent and costly pattern. Revolutionary promises were often followed by expensive failures. The railroad repeatedly invested heavily in unproven technology, hoping to find advantages over conventional power. Gas turbines consumed fuel at unsustainable rates. A coal turbine could not survive its own fuel. Steam turbines broke down constantly. Centennials cracked under their own weight. Even successful designs like the Big Boys and the Challengers were scrapped en masse when diesel proved cheaper. The human cost accumulated alongside the financial losses. Crews died in boiler explosions, crossing accidents, and head-on collisions. Maintenance workers suffered burns from superheated equipment. Engineers operated machines that could fail catastrophically without warning. Union Pacific built its reputation on having the biggest and most powerful locomotives available, but big and powerful often meant dangerous and unreliable. The locomotives on this list share a common thread. They pushed the limits of what technology could safely achieve, and frequently those limits pushed back with fatal results. The most dangerous Union Pacific locomotives shared something fundamental. They prioritized power over everything else. From the earliest 440 locomotives that built the Transcontinental Railroad to the massive Big Boys that conquered the Wasatch Grades, Union Pacific consistently chose raw capability over caution. The results were spectacular machines that accomplished incredible feats. They were also machines that exploded, derailed, caught fire, and killed the men who operated them. Consider what this list represents. Construction era locomotives with no safety features. Gas turbines that burned crews and melted pavement. Experimental designs that cost millions and accomplished nothing. Massive engines scrapped by the dozen because maintenance was too expensive. Collisions that compressed 8 locomotives into 2. Boiler explosions that killed instantly. Union Pacific wanted the biggest and best. They got locomotives that made history, and locomotives that made widows. The railroad that built America's first transcontinental line did it with equipment that was dangerous from day one. That pattern never really changed. Power always came first. Safety was learned only through accumulated tragedy. And that is all. These were the most dangerous locomotives Union Pacific ever operated. Machines that combined incredible power with terrifying risk. Don't forget to subscribe for more railroad history. Here is another video I have specially selected for you. See you next time.